Dr. Felipe de Ortega y Gasca.
Ortego.
Ortego, I'm sorry, y Gasca, in Silver City, New Mexico, on Wednesday, March 14th, 2012. And I'm going to do a little bit of This Is Your Life.
All
So
right.
we're going to start off with you were born in Blue Island, Illinois in 1926. Your family were migrant workers. What was life like growing up on the migrant trail between Texas and Minnesota?
Oh, it was interesting growing up in the migrant trail in those particular years. One of the memories, the fondest memories that I have, is about the number of trips, but one trip in particular that my father, my family, my mother.
Let me stop you right there. I'm not getting this. For some reason, the audio is not as loud as it ought to be.
Should I be projecting more?
Yeah, if you can, but
Okay.
that shouldn't be the problem. I think. Make sure I put this battery in right. That is positive there. I'm gonna try. All right, so go ahead and say something.
Growing up during the latter part of the 20s, the early part of the 30s, was truly
Okay.
interesting.
All right, good. I think we're
Okay, good.
All right, so we're recording, and tell
Well,
me what life was like growing up on the migrant trail.
Well, that was interesting. That was interesting, actually, growing up in the migrant trail. My folks, of the number of trips that my family made, I had never made a trip with them to Minnesota, when they made the trip to Minnesota from San Antonio in 1926 to go pick beets. I was born on that trip when they were returning from Minnesota to San Antonio. My mother went into labor with me, and in Blue Island, we had stopped off to visit her brother, who lived in Blue Island at the time. There was a very large Mexican-American community there at the time, a Mexican and Mexican-American community. But the other trips that we made were those we went west from San Antonio. And one of those trips, it must have been about 1931 or 32, that we came through Deming. There was no interstate then, but we came through Deming, picked up 180, and came past this university. There weren't many buildings then. There might have been 2 or 3, as I remember now. But never in the world did it ever occur to me. We were on our way through Arizona to California, and it never occurred to me that one day in the future I'd be part of this university. It was then a very normal school for teachers. That's the most emphatic memory that I have. But I do have memories of kind of working with other kids who were also with their parents in the migrant stream. And we'd go out and pick, if there were apples, we'd pick some apples. Not that we were working for a wage, but we entertained ourselves that way.
Let me ask you, let's fast forward a little bit to 1943.
Mm-hmm.
Because of your family's migrant trail experience, you were held back in grade 1 and 4.
Yes.
And so by 1943, you're 17 years old, you haven't graduated from high school.
Right.
And you decide to enroll in the Army. Tell me, how did that come about?
Well, 1943 were really the dark days of World War II for the United States. We weren't sure we were going to win that war, actually, by that time. And inasmuch as I was already 2 years behind my cohort, and I should have been in the 11th grade, going into the 12th grade, I just quit completely and joined the Marine Corps, not the Army.
So you joined the Marine Corps, and did you Did you see action?
Yes, I was at Iwo and Okinawa
You were
in 1945.
and what role did you play there?
I was
You were with the Marine Air Group 24. Tell me about that.
Well, Marine Air Group 24, we were flying Corsairs, and my job was to, as a machinist, my job was to be sure that and I was just a corporal in those days. I didn't become a sergeant until after. But my job was to be sure that as a machinist that I was able to turn out the parts that were needed and in order to keep the airplanes in the air, or afloat, I was going to say, but in order to keep them in the air. And I was not a ground pounder. In other words, I wasn't assaulting the beaches. I was on a tender, and it was a repair tender, so that we were guarded by other ships, and sometimes we'd go aboard an aircraft carrier to repair a plane, or sometimes we went ashore, depending upon where that airplane was and how we needed to get it in repair. So the action was going around me, but I wasn't shooting at anybody necessarily. There were times when I did shoot and times when we were shot at, but that wasn't my principal mission. My principal mission was, as a machinist, make sure that those airplanes were in good repair.
That was pretty vital.
I think so.
After this, you served briefly in China, and then you went to enroll at the University of Pittsburgh in 1948. Why Pittsburgh? You mentioned it earlier. Why Pittsburgh? And why did you major in, of all things, French?
Well, why Pittsburgh? It was because...
and again, if you could let us know what
sure.
year.
In 1940, I went to live in Pittsburgh with family, my father's family. My folks died in 1936 when I was 10 years old, and so my two sisters and my brother, we went to live with our uncle in Chicago for 4 years. But in 1940, my aunt could no longer support us, or she got tired of us, so we were parceled out to family. And my lot was to go with my father's cousin, Ernesto Mendez, who was married to a black woman, Mrs. Lucy. And so I had good years there with them from 1940 to 1943. Yeah. And that's how I came to be in Pittsburgh.
Okay. And you enrolled at the university?
Well, after the war, then in 1946, when I was discharged from the Marine Corps, I went back to Pittsburgh. That's essentially where I felt I was at home, and went to work in the steel mills. Worked at Jones & Laughlin Steel Mills, U.S. Steel, a number of steel mills in Pittsburgh for 2 years. And then it occurred to me one day that I wanted something out of life that was more than just steel worker. So I went to the VA, and thanks to the VA, they were able to get me into the University of Pittsburgh, where in 1945, Chancellor Fitzgerald, who was the president, so to speak, of Pitt, had issued a proclamation that any veteran was welcome at Pitt, regardless of his or her standing. And that's how I got into the University of Pittsburgh with only 1 year of high school, no GED. And to this day, I don't have a GED or a high school diploma.
You just have a PhD.
That's it, in English. Yeah, at Pitt, I studied French at Pitt because I was a comparative studies major, and that meant that I studied Spanish. I learned the Spanish of Spain. I learned the French of France. I studied a year of Italian. I was a comparative studies major, so studied several languages, among them English, Spanish, French, Italian, and 1 year of Russian.
Wow, that's impressive. Can you remember any of it?
Oh, до свидания.
So after graduation, you then went back to the Air Force, and you were a pilot from 1952 to 1956. eventually landing in El Paso. Now, during this time, you had a very interesting experience. Could you tell us a little bit about this thing we were talking about earlier?
About the Air Force,
Yeah.
our secret security
Measures.
national, what was national, um, um, it was a super secret national strategy for defending the nation. Yeah. Actually, I was an ROTC student at the University of Pittsburgh, and so out of that I got a commission as a second lieutenant in the Air Force Reserve in 1952. And in 1953, the Air Force was looking to replace its pilot population. So I applied for flying school and was accepted, and went to Goodfellow Air Force Base in Texas, San Angelo, Texas, in class 53O, with a whole bunch of other second lieutenants. And so I flew the L-19, the T-6, the B-25, and then my first duty assignment out of flying school was in 1954 at State Air Force Base in Reno, Nevada. And so there I learned to fly the C-47. And it was there that I was part of the 8th Air Rescue Group, a special group organized by General Curtis LeMay. And his idea, he was the World War II bomber expert who masterminded all the B-29 raids over Europe. And so after the war, he established this rescue unit out in Nevada, and his contribution to national security was to create this 8th Air Rescue Group that would be the way in which we would rescue our downed pilots who would fly the B-36. And by the way, that B-36, there were 2 squadrons of B-36s in El Paso in the 50s. And these B-36s then would fly to the Soviet Union on one-way missions, since air-to-air refueling was just nascent. We really didn't have a full capacity for air-to-air refueling. So these B-36s would fly to the target, big as they were. They had 6 engines, 3 on the backside of each wing, and they were hard to maneuver. So they would drop their load and slowly maneuvering away from the target. After they were some distance away, assuming that the blast of the nuclear bomb wasn't going to get them, then they would ditch the airplane, leave the airplane, and then the C-47s, which were Curtis LeMay's invention, would come in treetop level and pick up these downed pilots who would signal the C-47s with little URC-4 radios.
Wow.
Oh, it was a disaster. It was, well, given the technology we had, I suppose it was the best possible plan. But in retrospect, given now the kind of technology that we have, it's a wonder. If we'd had a war, I don't think we would have survived it. That's my thought, yeah.
Let me stop you there just for a second.
And the reason for one on each wing is as they got the pulse signals, they could, if they got the pulse signal to the left, then the plane would automatically line up with that signal. And if it was on the right, well, line up that way. And that's how then once they were lined up, then the pilot took control of the airplane again.
Eye contact with me. So that must have been really interesting. Now, I understand that as early as the early 50s, you were already beginning to write. When did you first discover you had an interest or a skill in writing?
Well, the first poem that I ever wrote was in 1942, which was published in the high school that I went to, Scott High School, that was published in their literary magazine, 1942. Odd piece of poetry. I had no sense at that time that I ever wanted to be a writer. But after the war, then and at Pitt, I started writing. I was on the Pitt paper. It was a daily paper for we had 35,000 students here then. And so thanks to Abraham Lauf, who was my writing teacher and who also was a had been a journalist and ran the pit paper. So I began, I spent the first year learning the trade of journalism trade by getting coffee for all the other writers, sharpening their pencils, emptying wastebaskets and whatnot. But in the second year, they put me on the rewrite desk so that the stories would telephone to us. A stenographer would take it down and give me the type copy, and then I would rewrite it so that it fits some editorial standards that we had. And that's how I learned to write.
So you were learning on the job.
Mm-hmm. And then in '52, in the spring of in the summer of '52, after I graduated, I did an internship at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette.
Okay. So after your stint in the Air Force, at which you retired in 1962 as a major.
Yes.
You're 36 years old, and that alone is no small accomplishment for any Mexican American at that time.
I was the only Mexican American in my flight school.
Wow. Why leave the Air Force as a major? You're already a major, and enroll in an uncertain future as a graduate student in what we now know as UTEP.
Well, I suppose I make light of it by saying that I left the Air Force when I realized that I was never going to be Air Force Chief of Staff. But despite that kind of humor, there was a lot of truth to it. I would not have, I probably could have become a bird colonel, maybe a lieutenant colonel, one more rank up from major, and that would have been it. Yeah, there was, I didn't perceive it then, but there was very little future for a Mexicano in the Air Force. Yeah, despite the fact that I had been on a sort of a fast track. Yeah, but had I been an engineer, I probably would have retired from the Air Force. But here I was in the humanities, you know, interested in literature, interested in writing. And that's one of the things that attracted me to UT at El Paso. The fact that that I had been there. My last duty assignment was in El Paso at Biggs Air Force Base, and so I liked it. I took courses there. It was called Texas Western then, and so the graduate program there was it was the University of Texas. It was the Texas Western College of the University of Texas. So my degree on the wall there listed as University of Texas, who issued all graduate degrees in those years.
So that was your BA?
No, that was my MA.
Your MA.
Yeah.
So then you enroll in the University of New Mexico, and in 1971 you get your PhD.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Now the period from say 65, 66 to 71 is a very exciting period. It's the beginnings of the movimiento.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Tell me how you began to become aware that there was something afoot.
Well, I didn't become aware of it until 1966.
Aware of what?
Aware of the movimiento, the Chicano movement. I was teaching at New Mexico State University from 1964 to 1970. And in '66, by chance encounter, one of those serendipitous moments when I was coming out of the building where the English department was housed, and this fellow in khaki and a funny hat asked me where he can get a cup of coffee. It turned out to be Octavio Romano. So I directed him. We had coffee. I went and had coffee with him. And he was visiting his in-laws who lived in Las Cruces. But that chance encounter, or as a consequence of that chance encounter, he came back and we visited a number of times that summer. And that's when he told me that he was planning with others in Berkeley the creation of a magazine called El Grito, and it was going to be published by Quinto Sol Publications. And that's how I became involved in the literary side of the movement. At the time, I had no idea about the length and breadth of Mexican American literature, none at all. Other than the fact that I knew that I was a Mexicano, I had never read anything by a Mexicano. Yeah. And so in, give me a moment. In '66 then, I'd mark that as the beginning of my concientización as a Chicano. That's when I became aware that I needed to go back to my my natal name of Felipe. And I was Philip Ortego because when I started school in San Antonio in '32, the Americanization process was that if you want to make Americans out of these Mexicans, change their names. You know. Jesus would be, I don't know how Jesus would have been translated. Jesse.
I
Jesse.
translated it as Jess.
Jess.
And I went through the same thing. In junior high, I decided that I wanted to be more American, and so I stopped hanging out with Mexican kids, and I changed my name from Jesus to Jess. And it wasn't until '68 with the Chicano movement that I changed it back with a totally different conciencia by then, you know, which is what you're saying.
Yes.
So please continue.
So I started out then, I became Felipe Ortego, and then slowly by '69 and '70, I thought about adding my mother's name to my name, to my handle. And so that I became Felipe de Ortego y Gasca. And now, certainly for the last 40 years, that's become my professional name. My legal name is still Philip, because it was so hard to think about changing all those documents. So my driver's license is Philip Ortego. Much the way Martin Sheen is Martin Sheen professionally, but he's Emilio Esteves, yeah.
Yeah. So this was an exciting time because we're beginning to see the first blossoming of what would become a literary renaissance. And you were on top of it. You wrote an article about the literary renaissance. And you were having this one-on-one with Octavio Romano
Yes.
and the people over in Berkeley.
Yeah.
And you were published by them, right?
Oh, yes, yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, I had the good fortune of getting published in their several first issues, like Volume 1, 2, Volume 3, I think I got something in there. But
Of El Grito.
Of El Grito, yes. And as I was publishing, in 1970, I was asked by the University of Texas at El Paso. Ray Small was Dean of Arts and Sciences then. One day I got this telephone call at New Mexico State asking, he knew who I was because I had studied there, and so he asked if I'd be interested in applying for the position of Director of Chicano Studies. So I said, okay. So I did, and lo and behold, the Mecha students interviewed me, and I don't know how many applicants they had, but they settled on me. And so I went to El Paso, UT El Paso, in August of 1970 as the founding director of Chicano Studies. And with the Garcia brothers, you remember them at all? Mario and...
oh yeah, Mario Garcia, sure.
Yeah, and his brother.
Yeah. Well, Mario's over at UCB now.
Yes,
Yeah.
well, they were graduate students. They were graduating. They were graduate students at UT El Paso, and with those, the Garcia brothers and myself, we wrote the Chicano Studies proposal.
And this was the first Chicano Studies in the state of Texas.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Say that to me again.
That was the first Chicano Studies program in the state of Texas, written with the help of the Garcia brothers. I don't know if they acknowledge that or not, but so we got that approved, and we had a hard. By that time, now the Garcia brothers had moved on they went on for PhDs, but after that first year, 1970-71, we had such a hard time convincing the administration. Ray, what was his name? Ray Smiley was the president, and the departments at the university were so reluctant to help us to recruit Chicano faculty. There were only 4 of us Chicano faculty on campus at the time. What was her name? She was in the School of Education.
Teresa?
Not Teresa. This before Teresa Melendez, or Josie Tinajero. Before them, Hernandez. Anyway, there were 2 Chicano faculty, one in physics and one in education, and then the social work.
Oscar?
The social worker. His name will come to me. He and I doubled the Chicano faculty. I went there as the founding director and an appointment in the English department. Yeah. So you can imagine.
Let me just stop you there a minute.
Yes, it was.
You see it here?
I'm getting over a cold. I had been in 1969. Let me have another napkin.
Yeah.
If there's one there. Or did we use it last? Okay, there we go. Okay. While teaching at New Mexico State University, I started, after I finished my master's degree in '66, while I was working at New Mexico State, I started almost immediately on the PhD program at UNM. And so I went summers. I spent summers 66, 67, 68, 69. In the summer of '69, when I took my comprehensives for the PhD, his name was, anyway, we had a UNM organized or authorized organization of a Chicano Studies program there. And the name of the first director is escaping me. But I was there, Tomas Atencio was there at the time, I was there. I was at UNM that summer finishing the comps, but I decided to stay at UNM the academic year of '69-'70 as a teaching fellow in the English department. And Louis Bransford was the first director. He asked if I could organize a course in Mexican-American literature for the program. Well, I said, sure, easy enough. I organize other courses. So I organized that course. However, I had a hard time finding material for the course that was in print. So that led me, I had 120 students who signed up for that course. And I was providing them with material that was mimeographed, you know, stuff. We didn't have photocopying the way we have today, but nevertheless, we made enough material to keep the interest of the students. And that was, I learned later, the first course in the country on Mexican-American literature, or Chicano Lit, yeah. And I taught that in the fall of '69. Well, I was so moved by that experience, I had finished 3 chapters of a dissertation on Chaucer. I did a master's on Hamlet. I'm now working on this Chaucer dissertation. So I went to Joe Zavadil, department chair, head of the English department, and told him that I was interested in changing my dissertation topic from Chaucer to Chicano Lit. Well, he thought I was crazy. I just needed one more chapter to finish the dissertation on Chaucer. But anyway, he agreed if I could find 3 faculty who could be my committee. He didn't think I could find them. So I found the 3 newest faculty to be on my committee. And the chair of that committee lives nearby here. I'm in touch with him. So
So he's aware of the monster he created.
Yes. So it was because of the interest that course generated in me that I spent then the next year. I delayed my PhD by a whole year. So I started doing research. I went to Berkeley, the California, Los Angeles, the archives. The archives in Santa Fe were very important. I lived in those archives, actually, getting the material. I went to UT, made 2 trips to Mexico City. I really threw myself into this research. And the upshot was that I learned what a great trove of literature Mexican Americans had, and many of whom were unaware of it. Maybe they knew this work or another work, but the historical sweep of that trove had been hidden, obscured, not necessarily by deliberately, but certainly had been obscured from our people. And that's why today Mexican American studies is so important, especially, well, all of it, but especially for me, the literary side, which is why it's a tragedy, this thing that's going on in Tucson, the elimination of Mexican American studies. They really are tearing out our heart.
Okay, good. Let me move on here.
Let me take the manuscript for your things.
Since these early days, you've been literally all over the map. You did pioneering work founding La Luz magazine in Denver, published from 1982 to
1972 to 82.
Yeah. And then from 83 to 93, you were editor-in-chief and founding publisher of the National Hispanic Reporter out of Washington, D.C. Why did these, what need did you see that needed to be filled, which inspired these two very important projects?
Well, the first one was really inspired by Dan Valdez, who was the publisher of La Luz magazine. Yeah.
So start again.
Yeah. The first was inspired.
Just start with La Luz, yeah.
La Luz magazine was inspired initially by Dan Valdez from Denver, who saw the need for, at that time, in '72, saw the need for some kind of publication that would be for, by, and about Latinos, or principally Hispanos, as he called them. He never liked the term Chicano, but he let me use it. We were about the same age. I was already much older when I started graduate school for the PhD. As a matter of fact, I was 45 years old when I got the PhD, so that made me old, but young in the European tradition when you don't get the PhD until you're 40 or 50. Yeah. But in any case, though, Dan Valdez took me under his wing when I failed to mention that I only lasted 2 years at UT El Paso with the Chicano Studies program, because in the second year of the program, or the beginning of the second year of the program, the university was so intransigent. Joe Smiley was president. Joe Smiley just wasn't giving us the kind of support we needed. So the students in December, it was December 10th of 1971, we went to talk to Joe Smiley in his office at the administration building, UT El Paso. And when we were getting nowhere, about noon, the Mecha students ushered the secretaries out, locked the doors, and we held the president hostage for 36 hours. Well, I say that there were about 3,000 students that circled the administration building, wouldn't let anybody in, certainly not the police. And but one of the students who, of all things, went on to become chancellor of the University of Missouri system, one of those youngsters who was one of those 35, he pointed out to me that not 3,000, Felipe, 5,000 students surrounded that building, locked arms, and on the roof of the Student Union building, there were SWAT teams, there were National Guard, the Sheriff's Department. People say, oh, it was peaceful. Not so peaceful. These people were carrying rifles, and the students then overturned the buses that were there to cart us off. They let the air out of the police vehicles. And because of that, finally, when Joe Smiley relented and we settled it, I was considered to be the ringleader, when in fact I was not. I wasn't victimized by it, but I was just there as the elder of the professors helping the students. But Joe Smiley lost his job. They fired him, and they did not renew my contract. And that's how I wound up in Denver. And I wound up at Metropolitan State University as the executive VP to the president. He called me one day and said, "Yeah, I hear you're in trouble down there." Dan Valdez had told him. And would you like to come up here and work for me? Sure. So he named me his exec.
You got bumped up.
I got bumped up, exactly. And then Dan Valdez and I hit it off so well, he encouraged me to be the associate publisher of the new magazine. Those were great 10 years. Yeah. He gave me free rein to. We did a lot of things with that magazine. We published the first piece by Juan Bruce Naveau. It was published there. We published Ricardo Sanchez. We were publishing as many Hispanos as we could, and publishing materials that dealt with Chicano lit. Yeah. Finally, he died in '82, and that's when I sold my shares. It was a profit for stock company, and so I sold my shares. And in '82, thanks to Domingo Nick Reyes, I don't know if you know that
Sure,
name.
remember now.
Yeah.
Now, he was in D.C.
He was
So that
already
was
in
in DC?
D.C. and he invited me to come. He had something called the Mexican American Cultural, almost like Cultural Center, and so he changed the name of it to the Hispanic Foundation, and he asked me to come and be the first chair of the board. So I was then teaching at Our Lady of the Lake University. So I went in '82, and as soon as I arrived, Nick and I and 3 others organized the National Hispanic Reporter. And it was at the same time that Charlie Erickson organized the Hispanic Link. That very same month and year. He's still around.
Yeah.
So for 10 years, then we had the National Hispanic Reporter, and in '92, then I sold my shares. By that time, I had moved to, in '92, I had already been at Arizona State for 4 years, and in '92 I was at Texas Women's University. And my directions had changed, yeah. But those 20 years with both the magazine and the newspaper, they really imbued me with a strong sense of why, a strong sense that if Chicanos were going to succeed, we had to have our own institutions. Yeah. And it led to that little aphorism that I used to use on my email, that the history of the lion hunt will always favor the hunter until lions have their own historians. So
Yeah.
that's where I'm at.
So during all this time, what's been going on concurrently throughout the United States has been this renaissance. It just keeps growing, and now it has also begun. We begin to see in the '70s, mid '70s and onward, we begin to see the Chicana voice. Tell me a little bit about how you saw this Chicana voice begin to emerge in Chicano literature, and what it was a response
Sure.
to.
Well, let me say to begin with that in 1971 I wrote actually in 1970 I wrote a piece called The Chicano Renaissance, and I had a hard time placing that piece. Nobody would publish it. None of the English journals, certainly not the, since it was in English, what was that? The American Association of Teachers of Spanish and Portuguese wouldn't publish it in Hispania. They wouldn't publish it, not because it wasn't a good piece, but because it wasn't in Spanish. But in any case, nobody would publish that piece until Margaret Mangold, who was editor of the Journal of Social Casework in New York, got wind of it through a social work friend of mine, Lydia Aguirre, and so she published it as a collection or as a special issue of the Journal of Social Casework dedicated to Chicanos. And my piece then on literature was in there. Yeah. If it hadn't been for that, I don't know where and when that piece would have been published. Yeah, but in that period of time, the Chicanos were publishing extraordinarily well. That was really the big rise in that boom. So where were the women? Las mujeres estaban ahí haciendo las tortillas, you know. They were making coffee, taking care of the kids. And I must say that the Chicanos just didn't give them much encouragement. And so in the late 70s and certainly by the 80s, the Chicanas, who they had already been writing, they just weren't given the opportunity, however, to publish. And we weren't very interested, I think. None of us, I have to say myself, as a Chicano, I just hadn't given them paid much attention to them. So what happens in the 80s as the Chicano production begins to taper off, people saying, oh, well, that's the end of the Chicano Renaissance, that's the end of Chicano literature. Well, it really wasn't, because about that time you had this little wave coming up in the last part of the 70s, early part of the 80s, and it begins to grow. Frankly, Jesus, I think that it eclipsed the Chicanos completely, eclipsed them. And I think that they're not to put any evaluation on their work, because it is incredibly important and exceptional, but the Chicanos brought it on themselves, I think. Now, I've been agitating for some kind of merger. You know, can't we get together? Because we're in the same boat. Yeah. But I'm impressed by the Chicanas.
Let me stop you right there. As in your mature stage now, looking back on this exemplary life, what are the takeaways? What are the lessons you've learned that can empower future generations of Chicanos and Chicanas, having to do with their growth, their careers, and particularly something that I think you and I are very committed to is community service?
Well, for me, the biggest takeaway is that all these years that I've been writing now, and that I think I finally have learned how to write. And it took me a long time to find my voice as a writer. I think that the first piece that probably reflects that voice is the piece that I did in 1970 for the Center magazine called Montezuma's Children, which was published by the Center magazine. That's John Maynard Hutchins' Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions out of Santa Barbara. And Senator Ralph Yarborough that year read it into the Congressional Record, and it became a rather celebrated piece and recommended for a Pulitzer that year, which I didn't get, but it was the first piece I think that I think has my voice in it. Before I was learning how to write, Jean-Paul Sartre in his memoir calls that stage of development, that period when you're learning how to join things up, how to hook up words, how to put ideas together. I think I finally got that in that particular piece. Yeah. And since then, I think that I've grown in the art of writing, and the takeaway then is that since I think I know what it is to write and how to write, that I can then help our students to write. Yeah, I have students, I'm teaching, for example, this is now finishing my 4th year, teaching a freshman English course at a local high school in Bayard called Cobre High School. And this will be my 8th semester teaching there. These youngsters come to this particular university with many strikes against them. The principal strike being that our faculty here, which is predominantly Anglo, we have 25 Hispanic faculty for a small school. But the Anglo faculty thinks that this is a great university. The problem is the wrong students come here. They don't think that our students are prepared to come to college. There are many that talk about, well, they should really be in a community college or go to trade schools or whatnot. Well, in the 8 semesters of my teaching at Cobre, those kids are incredible. And this is a senior class. They're incredible writers. I had one student whose work I've managed to help them to get published, high school student. Yeah. And that speaks for all of them. And I keep talking to them, giving them a lot of dopamine instead of cortisol, by feeding them dopamine, I said, you know, you guys know how to write. All you have to do is write. Well, sometimes it's hard to motivate these high school students, but I think that I'm getting to them finally, and that's the takeaway for me. Helping these youngsters who are 17, 18 years old, finishing high school, what are they going to do? Well, I hope that I'm part of that encouragement in the same way that Abraham Lauf encouraged me when I was at Pitt, when he kept telling me I'd get my papers back. They were covered with red ink all over them. Well, I didn't realize that the more red ink on there was the more potential he thought we had.
Talking about, I have some general questions having to do with writing. You spoke earlier about finding your voice. How does an author find their unique voice? What are the steps, do you think?
That's such a tough question. I wanted to say initially that I think it's a question of kind of going inside yourself, looking at what, I suppose a kind of an infra-reality. You know what you want to say, but the question is how to say it and having the courage to say it. My latest piece of fiction is a piece of sort of Edgar Allan Poe type story called 1210 Pine Street, about an episode, a nightmare that I had when I was a youngster, and I lived at 1210 Pine Street. It was published by Armando Rendon, you know his work, Somos en Escrito. He published it for the first time just last fall. And in that piece, the voice in that piece is me.
Could you be careful not to do this?
Oh, okay, yeah.
The mic is just going bomb.
The voice in that piece is me. Theretofore, stories that I wrote, I was trying to create a voice for a particular character. And that's difficult in itself. But the piece comes closer, I think, to life, or comes stronger to life when it's my voice in the role of the narrator, yeah, as opposed to doing, say, a third-person story when it's rather a first-person story. Yeah.
You were talking about character. How do you find a character, and how do you find the voice of a character? You know, I ran into this when I was writing from the point of view of a 14-year-old Chicanita. Well, I'm not a 14-year-old Chicanita, so I had to do some research. But how do you put yourself in the voice of a character that is fundamentally different from who you fundamentally are? Or do you?
Yeah. Sometimes I think there is authenticity, can be authenticity in it, but more often than not, I suspect that it may not work. And let me cite an example there. I know you're familiar with Steinbeck's Tortilla Flat. Well, Steinbeck, as much as he may have known who the Okies were in Grapes of Wrath or in of Mice and Men, he didn't know anything about his paisanos of Monterrey. Yeah. And so he gives voice to those paisanos, especially the key figures. Pilar is one of them, and he has one of them approaching Pilar saying, "Hello, Pilar, whither goest thou? What hast thou beneath thy great coat?" Well, I give Steinbeck credit for trying to find in the English language the Spanish tu, which is he was using the now obsolete form of the personal that we've eliminated in English language, but we haven't eliminated in Spanish. So he was trying to recreate that Spanish tu by using the old-fashioned English tu. Well, it didn't do anything for the novel. I think it really weakened it. On top of which, one of the maxims in writing is write what you know. Well, he didn't know the people of Monterey. It would be like me trying to write a novel about Jewish life in New York.
But surely you believe that any great writer can put himself in the persona of any people that he wishes, but he needs to do his homework. But don't you think, I mean, because otherwise it would say that Chicanos could only write about Chicanos.
Well, and you're right. Yeah, that's an interesting, I don't know if that's sort of a conundrum, but you're right, yeah. It would be a lot like saying that, well, I can't write on Chaucer because I'm not English. Yeah.
Exactly. I had this conversation with Max Martinez because, you know, he started creating non-Chicano or half Chicano characters.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a very challenging, innovative kind of thing to be doing, because I do believe that as artists, you don't want to have ceilings, you don't want to have limits.
Yeah. So you knew Max.
Oh, very good friends. I've created him in my short story collections. I got permission from the wife and the sister and the mother to use his name and his persona, and I have him in both of my short story collections. I'll send it to you.
Yeah.
Get a kick out of him.
Well, Max is one of my favorites. I thought he did remarkably well with the Chicano kids.
Yeah. He got a lot of heat from the women, but
Yeah.
that's another story. So what about bilingualism? You know, almost all Chicano writers use one form or another. What are your criteria for when you use the Spanish and when you use the English?
Well, I don't know if there's a criteria. I think it has to come very naturally. So, sometimes you can see when someone is trying to create that Spanglish, what's the word I'm looking for? That
What is it?
Calor, mezcla.
The calor, the mezcla?
is another word. It'll come to me.
Spanglish?
Well, but it's there's a linguistic term for it.
Code
switching. Yeah,
code
that's
switching.
it. Yeah. When you try to create it artificially, it doesn't work. It has to come very naturally. There is a logic to Spanglish. And I think Rosario Sanchez probably does the best job of explaining what that logic is. That and when you speak it, it's very natural. You can't all of a sudden just yoke two parts of the sentence of Spanish and English together. It has to come at a particular place in the sentence, and only those of us who grew up that way do it so automatically that we don't have to figure out where to yoke it. It just yokes itself. Yeah. I think that it is a phenomenon that we have yet to fully understand and to explain and to have it accepted by the audience at large. Here's what I do in my linguistic classes these days, and for some time. I tell them, just imagine how Latin must have been when the Romans went to Iberia, to Spain, when they went to England, when they went to France, when they were in Germany. And these people, the soldiers, the Roman soldiers, are speaking Latin, the Latin that they recently brought from Rome with them. Now, just add 100 years to that, and what happens with those two languages in contact, when the two languages begin to influence each other, when we get what is comparable to today's Spanglish, we get Latin and French, Latin and English, Latin and the languages of the Iberian Peninsula. And then the Moorish, when they come in and they add to that mix. I tell my students and try to argue publicly that what we are in the midst of is a tremendous linguistic shift. It's a paradigm shift linguistically, that we are actors in this great linguistic change that is taking place, and in the United States principally. But if you have Spanish speakers in France interacting with French, you're getting the same activity, yeah, with French and Spanish coming together. When I lived in France, and I heard French youngsters saying, "Donnez-moi un hot dog," you know. people, the French, oh, they think that's barbarism, bringing in those neologisms, those coinages into the French language. Well, languages, and my students laugh at this, languages are like consenting adults. They go in one day together, you don't know what's going to happen. They're going to create all kinds of issues.
One of the areas, however, for us as Chicanos, if you're in Mexico or Argentina, you can write in Spanish because that's the national language. Here, you want to write in English to reach a larger audience that is not going to be privy to some, certainly not to some of the Spanish, but also particularly not to some of our calor-isms, our barrio-isms. And so there is that responsibility, if you really want to communicate to the wider audience, to provide some help in terms of some, I hate to say the word definitions, but basically that. And obviously, we had a talk yesterday, or the day before yesterday, with Ernesto Hogan, who writes science fiction, Chicano, Irish guy, and writes science fiction. And he says that when he does it, he tries to avoid, which I've seen badly done, where give me the coffee, just put, or give me the milk, or the leche, just put a little bit of that milk in my coffee. You know, where it's so obvious that you're translating for those who don't get it,
Yes.
that it becomes really obvious. What he does is he tries to do it by usage.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about that. What is the unique challenge that a bilingual Chicano author might have that would, you know, he wants to reach a larger audience in English, but yet he wants to give them a little bit of who we are?
Well, I think also it's a question, Jesus, that it's not only you're trying to reach a larger audience, but it's a question of, as the writer, what else is subtextually in that effort? And that is that, that it's also, it seems to me, our responsibility, or perhaps our mission, to educate the reader, bring the reader up a notch or two, not only to reach the reader, but to bring the reader up a notch or two intellectually, perhaps. Now, nobody seemed to complain when Ezra Pound was writing and he used Greek, Latin, Russian, introduced all those words. He was essentially doing what we do with Spanglish, you know, when we write or speak in Spanglish. Yeah. And he's considered really almost revered by the fact that he wrote that way, by introducing words that the reader would have to go to a dictionary or ask someone to explain what was going on. And so I've called that, it enriches the text from my perspective. And I've called that it's sort of like a bilingual metaphor, where you have not only the power of one language in actuating the imagery of the metaphor, but now you have two. And the person who I thought was the most skillful, at least creatively in doing that, was Ricardo Sanchez. He, when you read, especially when you read anything that's in hechizo spells, he's just a master at that. So I say to my colleagues too, I say, well, with these kids who come here, have them write in bilingually if they're so inclined, because it will provide you with text whose imagery I think will be enhanced tremendously by that.
Let's talk a moment about content. You know, Ricardo is a good example of the proclamation writing. Yo soy Chicano. You know, my first film was Yo soy Chicano. And it really said it, you know. And then you, for a lot of artists, we started at that, and then we began to evolve personally, as did the movement. And we began to say, hey, you know, we did that. We want to go beyond. We want to find more universal metaphors of the human condition with us as the particular, with us as the reference point, and speak to a broader audience and speak to broader issues. How do you see, do you think that there's been an evolution of that in our literature?
Oh, I think so.
And remember to incorporate my question.
Sure. Yes, I think there's been an evolution in that whole process of creation, especially linguistic, and I think also in the way in which we have portrayed characters, especially those who write fiction. Yeah, the way in which those characters have been created. Some of those characters are so memorable precisely because they are bilingual, and sometimes bilingual doesn't really explain all of it, because when we think of bilingual, we think about two languages, but that which is happening in the blend of those two languages, that's the real creativity that I see, and that's our legacy to the United States, I think, and to American literature. You probably know that one of my missions has been to incorporate or to have Chicano literature, Mexican-American literature, be considered as part of American literature. Not just Mexican-American literature since 1848, but all of the literature that our antecedents wrote from the time of, say, Cabeza de Vaca's journeys through Texas, Villagra's poem about New Mexico, and then scores of other works that are, we consider them part of Spanish literature, the Spanish colonial literature. Well, just as we have incorporated into, as the foundations of American literature, the British colonial literature from the beginning to 1776, all of that literature is really English. But we've claimed it as part of American literature. Well, why not claim then all of that Spanish colonial literature comparable to British colonial literature as a foundational literature of American literature? The problem is Thomas Pierce, who was one of my profs at UNM, the way he put it is, the problem is that it was written in Spanish. And if it's not in English, then it can't be English, anything English literature. One of my rejoinders then is that, look at Isaac Bashevis Singer, who wrote in Yiddish. Are his works in not American literature? They are, although his sister's the one who translated them for us. What's his name? Ole Rolvag, a Norwegian American from Minnesota, who wrote Giants in the Earth in Norwegian. It is now considered, and thank God, it is now considered an American classic, even though it was not written in English. Yeah. So if we can incorporate those into American literature, it seems to me that we can, in good conscience, incorporate then the works of our Spanish forebears or antecedents into American literature. That's been my big goal. I'm having a hard time.
Let me stop you there. I'm running out of tape, so I'm going to stop.